Brilliance Audio presents the unabridged recording of The Witch's Guide to Cooking with Children by Keith McGowan, performed by Laural Merlington. For Angelica, from Hansel und Gretel by Jakob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm. The old woman shook her head and said, "Ay, my dear children, who has brought you here? Come on in and stay with me. No harm will come to you." She took both by the hand and led them into her cottage. Hansel and Gretel lay themselves down and thought they were in heaven. But the old woman had only pretended to be nice. She was an evil witch. She waylaid children and had built the bread cottage simply to lure them in. Once they fell into her clutches, she finished them off, cooked them and ate them, and that was, for her, a merry holiday. How to Cook and Eat Children, a cautionary tale by the witch Fay Holiday. I love children. Eating them, that is. I've eaten quite a few children over the centuries. You may wonder where I get them all. The answer is I get them the traditional way, from parents, of course. You'd be amazed how many parents have shown up at my hideaway with their children in tow, or written to me on their best stationery requesting that I take their children, pretty please. One group even rented a helicopter to find me and hand their children over. Daughters and sons they couldn't stand 1 second longer. If only children knew. I remember Derek Wissey, whose only fault, actually, was to fail math every year. Well, he was also a horrible speller. His parents couldn't understand it. They were both geniuses. Mr. Wissey had an M.D. and a Ph.D., while Mrs. Wissey had 2 Ph.D.s, 1 Ph.E., plus a very hard-to-get Ph.Z. The Wisseys didn't think it unreasonable that their child should be at least as smart as them. "How can you be my son and not do well in school?" Mr. Wissey asked. Mrs. Wissey was more sympathetic, but equally puzzled. "Why don't you try harder?" she pleaded with him. But, try as he might, Derek couldn't succeed. He brought home D's and F's on every report card. And those letters, unlike the ones Mr. and Mrs. Wissey had, weren't any good at all. Derek was a great disappointment to his parents. He didn't disappoint me, though. Baked with secret ingredients and served with my very yummy homemade key lime pie. And then there was Jane Markers, who foolishly gave one of her mother's expensive fur coats to a woman sleeping on the street. The woman seemed to need it more than her mother. "How could you?" Mrs. Markers asked when she found out. "But you have so many," reasoned Jane. "Yes," Mrs. Markers said, "but that one was a birthday present from your stepfather. It was very special." Jane shook her head. "Why can't you be more, what's that word?" "Generous?" asked Mrs. Markers. "Well, maybe I can," she said, considering it. "Yes, I'll try, Jane." And right after that, Mrs. Markers proved that she could be very generous after all. Very generous to me, that is. And I still remember Geoffrey Dock. Centuries ago, Geoffrey's parents trained him from his earliest days to love music. They started him on violin lessons as soon as he was big enough to push down the strings. By age 8, he was a brilliant musician, headed for youthful fame, just as his parents had planned. "One day soon you'll be playing before the royalty of all the world," they told him. "Won't that be wonderful?" Geoffrey's parents thought that it would. But then, one afternoon, he fell while climbing a tree in search of a ripe pear and broke his wrist. Just like that, Geoffrey's music career was over, and the Docks' grand dreams were spoiled. I, though, still saw great potential in Geoffrey, like how well he would turn out cooked with capsicum and washed down with a fine mead. Thanks to me, Geoffrey lived up to that potential. And recently there was rich Grant Feltright, who thought he was better than everyone else because of his family's wealth. He told his classmates, "My father could hire your parents as assistants." He bragged about family vacations, scuba diving, and skydiving. And he often won at sports, but only by tricking gullible kids into looking the wrong way at important moments. He thought that made him clever. His father told him, "This is not the way you uphold the honor of the Feltright name." But Grant wouldn't listen. So Mr. Feltright did what he needed to do to preserve the family name. And I preserved Grant in vinegar, salt, and sodium metabisulfite. I try to make it easy for parents to hand their children over. That way I get more children. I have put up some child drop-off boxes in convenient locations, many near movie theaters. Children always want to go to the movies. Parents take them there, and usually, to confuse the children, they buy them much more popcorn, candy, and soda than usual. Then, when the movie's over, they lead their children out the side exit and quickly throw them into one of my giant metal boxes labeled simply donations. These boxes have swinging doors at the top that open one way, in, but not the other. I also offer tours through my child-friendly travel bureau, as well as special hazardous children pick-up days 4 times a year. It's not like the old days. There's no more leading one's children into the forest. I don't live in the forest anymore. They've torn down the trees and built houses all around me. I've had to make my home look like all the rest. At least to the eyes. If you are a child and you are reading this, you may want to ask yourself a few questions. Do you demand unreasonable things from your parents? Do you always do what you are told? How often do you ask for a raise in your allowance? Have either of your parents said any time recently one or more of the following things? "I'm at the end of my rope. I'm sick and tired of your behavior." Or, very important, "I can't take it anymore." If the answers to these questions are yes, no, a lot, and yes, then you may want to consider changing your ways. You might wonder why I would tell you this. Wouldn't that mean one less delicious meal for me? But I'm not afraid of warning you. Of course not. I understand children quite well. Not just how to season them delicately, or what kind of side dishes go well with what kind of kids. I know all about not yet cooked children, too. I know they have little self-control. I know that one day they'll decide to be good, and the next thing you know, they'll forget all about it and get into trouble. They can't stick to their decisions. Their willpower is weak. I always get them in the end. I could get you, too. So wrote Fay Holliday one June night in a notebook titled How to Cook and Eat Children, a Cautionary Tale. Holliday's faithful cocker spaniel, Jay Swift, lay at her feet. His snout rested easily on his front paw, his big round eyes occasionally glancing up at his mistress, raising his eyebrows but not his head to look up. Outside it was dark. Inside Holliday's house, as she wrote, all was quiet. The only sound was that of Holliday turning a page, or the sound of her picking at a snack from a plate in front of her. She had prepared the snack herself. Delicious. Chapter 1. Saul and Connie. Monday. Solomon and Constance Blink, Saul and Connie for short, moved into the town of Grand Creek one hot day in the middle of August. Saul was 11 and Connie was 8. The late afternoon sun streamed over the mountains into Saul's new bedroom as he unpacked. He'd already taken out a telescope and a microscope. These allowed him to peer into other worlds, large and small, that sometimes seemed more appealing than this one. He examined the instruments, his hand at his chin, his long hair falling in front of his shoulders. He unpacked a box of science books next, checking their titles as he ordered and stacked them. Most of the books looked advanced, almost like what scientists might have had on their own shelves. Saul, you see, was a very smart boy. His intelligence, however, hadn't helped to make him the #1 most popular boy at his old school. Popular slots 2 to 100 had also been taken. Saul may have been remembering his old school just then, because his lips twisted into a grimace. Maybe he was even remembering his worst day ever. Last spring. The terrible day. He didn't know that an even more terrible day lay ahead for him. The next box Saul opened held a curious device, which he removed carefully. The device was something he had made himself. It had a CPU, Central Processing Unit, at center and an octopus of wires attaching the CPU to meters and a screen. That screen displayed, in order, the temperature, barometric pressure, time, and, based on all of that information, a guess at the current weather. The screen showed 82 degrees, 8:55 MB, 4:02 p.m., and sunny, which were all correct. Saul smiled and breathed a quiet snort. He set the device gently on the windowsill, then turned to his other boxes. In one he found his mother's old scientific treatise, yellowed and tattered. A talented scientist, Saul and Connie's mother had traveled many years before to study warming in the Antarctic. There she'd made a discovery of great importance. The ice shelf was melting at an alarming rate. Unfortunately, she discovered this while standing on the ice shelf, which, as predicted, melted and fell into the ocean. She was never heard from again. Though her results, radioed in, did survive and were hailed by the scientific world. Saul spent a few minutes paging through his mother's work, then his eyes fell on the thing that lay below it, a plaque that his sister Connie had given him last spring. The plaque read, "Many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they gave up. Thomas Edison." He turned the plaque face down and placed it in a spare box with some old books. After some time, he confronted one unlabeled box, all taped up, which he didn't open. Instead, he pushed it into the farthest reaches of his new closet, as if he never wanted to see it again. Then he went out of the bedroom to see how the rest of the moving was going and what his younger sister was up to. Connie was very different from her brother. She was outside the 2-story apartment building at that moment beside the moving truck. She'd climbed onto her family's sofa as it was being picked up by 2 of the movers, so that the movers carried both the sofa and Connie across the lawn and into the small building, with Connie sitting up very queen-like and slowly waving, first left and then right, to an imaginary audience of onlookers. Those onlookers were, in her mind, watching her brilliant and important entrance being carried into her new home. In the hallway outside the apartment, one neighbor did open her door to look out. Connie honored the neighbor with a wave and an elegant nod. To look at Connie enjoying herself that day, you would never have known that she was keeping a guilty secret from her brother. But then, you couldn't tell how much she missed her old cat Quantum either, and she missed Quantum very much. It wasn't that Connie didn't feel sad about her cat or guilty about the secret she kept from her brother. It's just that she wasn't one to mope. As to what she looked like, Connie was spry and flexible. She had very short hair and big ears that stuck out on either side of her small head, possibly made like that to let certain comments pass quickly into one and out the other, spending as little time as possible in between. Comments, for instance, like her father's outburst when the movers carried not just the sofa into the apartment, but Connie too.
"Connie, get off that couch this instant!"
Mr. Blink said. Mrs. Blink, who had married Saul and Connie's father just before the move, looked up from unpacking and shook her head in amazement. Connie was the tiniest bit slow in responding to her father's order, though, so that she slid off the sofa just after the movers put it down, completing her grand ride in style. Saul was coming out of the bedroom then and saw that his father and stepmother were upset. He ducked into the kitchen to pour himself a glass of ice water. It was very hot that Monday, then came out and said, "Connie, want to go to the park?" Connie nodded. "Dad, can we go?" he asked.
Anything that gets you out of here,
Mr. Blink answered,
is fine with me.
Saul and Connie found a frisbee and a tennis ball in one of the boxes lying in the living room. Before they left, Saul saw his glass of ice water, now mostly ice, on the counter and had the idea to teach Connie something. "Come look at this." He took her into the kitchen, poured some water into the glass, and added a couple more ice cubes. "I'm going to mark the level of the water." He found some masking tape and used that to do it. "Now when we get back and the ice is melted, will the water be higher than it is now, or lower?"
"Higher," Connie said.
"Why?"
"Because when the ice melts, there'll be more water, so the water will go up."
"Are you sure?"
"Yes."
"Are you willing to bet on it? Do you have any money?" Connie checked.
$3.
"Will you bet the $3?
"Sure. I'll bet you $3 the water'll be higher," she said stubbornly. "What do you say? You say it'll be lower?"
"Nope. I say it will be in exactly the same place after the ice melts. Want to take back your bet?"
"No,"
Connie said, not one to give in. Connie also wasn't one to lose a bet, though, especially if it involved her own money. So she made sure to sneak back as she and her brother were leaving to pour just a little more water into the glass. Then she caught up with Saul. She suspected that he knew more about this scientific matter than she did, but he didn't know enough to win $3 from her. Of that, she was certain.